Right, so you're not a framework developer is about not being stuck with what you work with. Just a bit about me, just to start. I'm basically working in development, like most of you, I guess. And I've been web developer for about 10 years. I've seen quite a lot of framework, I would say. And it's getting better. Well, get to that later on. I'm doing consulting, so I'm seeing quite a lot of really bad code, really bad project, ended up quite, really badly because of decisions that have been made, hence this talk. I'm also CTO in a service company, which means I supervise 10 developers, 10 developers right now, which work on different frameworks. And my goal as a CTO is to inspire them to not get stuck on what they already know and go to whatever else they don't know, because for me, it's all the same. And I'm doing all of this stuff as well, community-wise. So if you're interested, come and talk to me. Especially, I'm a big fan of Scotland PHP. I founded it a few years ago. So if you want to spend some time with beers and whiskey, just come and talk to me. So who here is paid to write code? Is that actually what you do? You only write code? Or are you like Laravel developers? Yeah, some of you? Symfony developers, maybe? A few hands? Or maybe you're more of a PHP developer, which means you can do both, or probably software engineers, kind of, which makes way more sense, because you don't get stuck on something which will disappear in a few years. So if you think you're a Laravel developer, say, are you answering this kind of jobs where it says Laravel developer only? Like, are you actually tied to your framework for a living? And so I've been doing ZF1 for quite a long time. If I tied myself to ZF1, I would be probably homeless right now, because nobody's doing it anymore. Some people are, and it's well paid, but you know, you know what I mean. It's not really a good framework anymore. So what happens if you're doing Symfony right now, Symfony 4? You're good, you're well paid. What in a few years? You'll probably get like less paid, get some legacy, crappy projects, or you could get well paid and get the projects and make them run again, but that's not everyone. So you're not actually someone who uses a framework to do dumb stuff. You're a problem solver, mostly. So people come to you with problems, complex problems, and they expect solutions that solve these very specific and complex problems. So basically, let's say you've got a very specific problem. Someone wants a list of contacts. So pretty simple, list of contacts. You start with any framework, and you should be able to do that in no time. Let's start with Symfony. First example. So going on the Symfony website, you won't see that on the Symfony website straight away because they're branding their own stuff with their new binary and stuff. But you could try it this way. Do a composer create project, Symfony website skeleton, or just skeleton, whatever you want. Get some more stuff, make your bundle. If you're a Symfony developer, you probably know it. And then create your entity, which is somehow your domain, and make a CRUD. And basically, you're done. If you're doing Laravel stuff, it's pretty much the same. Just change a few words. That's, exactly the same. You do make model instead of make entity. OK, all right. And then you create your controllers and stuff. There's a few more stuff you need to do in Laravel, because it's not built in the maker, but yeah, it does quite well. So is that what you're paid to do? Or are you doing something slightly more complex? So looking at both approaches, what we've seen is it's exactly the same thing. We've got some kind of model, entity, repositories, or model, whatever. You've got controllers, you've got views, you've got form type, form request, again, whatever. You could do Zen framework stuff. There's a form class, basically the same. And if you look at certifications, there's a list. I didn't put the image in, but there's a list of topics on every certification page. So Symfony has one, Zen has one, and Laravel has one as well. And if you look at all the topics in certifications, it's all the same again. So are all the frameworks exactly the same? Probably, I would say. Some may disagree, but yeah, it's still. So back to what we wanted to code. We've got our class. I hope most of you like UML. I love UML. It helps thinking before coding, which unfortunately not everyone's doing. But you know, you're not forced to do UML. You could do TDD if you're into TDD, but just think before. That always helps. And so our contract class should look something like this, basically. This is just plain PHP. That's a class. You've got a few stuff in it. And what we have is an object that we constructed from scratch. So once it's constructed, you know it's valid, basically. You won't get null value back or anything, which is great. But what if we look at Symfony, for instance? What did it generate for us? Doesn't look like a plain PHP class to me. And also looks like an dynamic entity, does it? Right. So maybe you're not paid to do that. Maybe that's the quick start, and you're paid to actually solve problems, not create problems. This one would create problems for you. Basically, your object is not always in a valid state. And if you're looking on top of the file, there's an ORM ID. And it's a generated value integer from the database, which means you're already coupled to your database to generate your IDs. It also means the ID will be generated whenever you write to your database, not whenever you create the object, which is a big difference. And you never know what's inside of the object. Could be filled with a first name, a last name. You don't know. What you know is everything is optional if you look at the return types. So that's actually really bad. That's what you get with Laravel. So yeah, quite interesting. You get nothing, basically. That's the active record magic going on here. The problem with that is, first, it's really not descriptive, and you don't really get the full OOP experience. Like, in OOP, you're supposed to work with contracts and share these contracts with other objects. In here, no one knows what you can use to contact your class. So we can use basically anything. Right, so is that really OOP? Yeah, there are objects, but we don't know. So does anyone actually work with the Maker bundle or any code generator at all? Or are you all kind of moving to a more maybe domain-driven approach? Yeah, so somebody says domain, I guess, here. Right, so basically because you're here to solve problems, you should not get coupled to your tools and basically do whatever the tool wants you to do. Like, if you use this class over here, you're probably doing an architecture that doesn't really fit with whatever the clients want. It basically fits with what the framework expects you to do, which is the best practice. So, yeah, don't trust these practices anyway. There are kind of trends, not really best practices. Good practices, maybe? I don't know. Right, so using these kind of tools, you basically couple your domain to your framework really tightly on different levels. So the first level you have is what happened from your client to your action, like to your controller. You're basically coupling with whatever form object they have. So you're probably sending your entity or your model, whatever you call it, straight to your form, which might be good, because if you have a one-to-one relation, that's really easy to manage. But if you happen to be in a situation where you need to add more fields or different non-related fields to your form, you'll just get stuck. So what you can do is basically decouple that. Another coupling layer you have is your persistence layer, because you're basically saying, yeah, everything I do in my controller is linked to my persistence layer, because if you're, in this case here, you are basically using magic method to access your database. If you're using this one, in exposing this one to your front, that's almost as bad, because we should never know that you have a first name and a last name. We should just know whatever you want us to know, which might be get full name or whatever you want to do with it. So encapsulation is one of the basic principles of OOP. So you should never expose stuff unless you need to. Right. So, yeah, back to our class. Here's an entity, a proper entity. So it has an ID to be able to fetch it. And it has a few properties. What we will do is construct it in one go. And that's not something you'll see in any framework documentation, I think. I've never seen it. Maybe there are frameworks which are more DDD related that are doing that, but main frameworks don't. And what we're doing is constructing everything from start. And that's done, and then we only have getters, no mutators for now. The second thing we're doing is creating a repository, which is an actual design pattern. It's not a repository as in Dutrion repository. It's a proper repository, so an object that manages a collection of objects, and basically designing whatever method we want in it. And then once we've done that, we're defining some kind of action. So what's an action? If you're doing Laravel or if you're doing any major framework, you're probably used to have a controller with many actions in it. An action can also be a simple class like this one, which is basically a callable. And you call your action, it could take a server request and always sends a response. And that's all it does, basically. And then it just gives whatever it has to do to a repository. So if we want to go this way in Symfony, it's actually pretty simple. We start by removing every annotations, because annotations couple your class to your framework. So remove annotations, move it to YAML, if you like YAML. That's just changing both lines here, which were annotations before, and the folder where you can find your classes. Move it to XML and Dutrion, or YAML and Dutrion. I like XML better. That's personal preference. Do whatever you want. That's my XML mapping. So basically what I had before and when I was doing annotations. It's all in one very small space. And because it's XML, it's validated. So pretty cool. You get that for free. And then I'm drafting a DTO. So a DTO, for those who don't know, is a data transfer object. That's an object I'll use with like public property in here, just to transfer my data from one point to the other. In this case, I want to transfer data from the view, from the form, to my action. And that's what was generated already inside of my Symfony project. So they basically create a form for you. And you've got this very small parameter here, data class, which says which classes it uses for transferring the object. So by default, when it's generated, it's contact as in entity contact. You could change it and just say contact as in my own DTO contact class. This way, you're not coupled with your persistence layer. You've completely decoupled it. The problem is, you still need to go from this class to your other entity class. So in your class, that's personal preference again. There's a lot of very opinionated things in this talk. But personal preference, I'm using static functions to go from my entity to my DTO and to go from my DTO to my entity. I'm storing these methods straight in my DTO. And basically, what it does is it iterates in one way or the other way. If you look at the code, it's actually quite weird. I'm using a lot of lines too. You might not need that. I like it, but yeah. It's just a way for me to iterate the object without actually having to have setters and getters. Yeah. You could do reflections instead or anything. That's implementation details anyway. Most of the time when you're doing code like that, you don't actually care about what's inside the method anyway. And I don't know how you work, but what I usually recommend when you do object-oriented programming is to basically close everything so you don't get to see what's inside. You just get to see the contract. It's way easier for you not to try to anticipate how it's going to work. Right, so that was the basics. Now we're able to switch back and forth from the DTO to the actual entity. And let's see how it goes with Laravel. Disclaimer, I'm not a Laravel developer, even if that doesn't really exist. But I'm not doing a lot of Laravel stuff, so my code might be messy. Right, so just copying the DTO from the Symfony project, because that's something which is not related to your framework anyway. So we can copy it. Right. Oops. My entity in Symfony was decoupled from the framework as well. So I can copy it again. And that's the bit that is still coupled to my framework and will always be coupled to it, because that's a choice in your design. You choose your framework because it's a tool that helps you in some way. In this case, you want it to help you with receiving your actual data and then passing it to whatever services you use. So basically, the request, form request in Laravel are a way to explain which fields you're expecting, then set a few validations here, and then you can do whatever you want, as long as you call the validated method here to receive your data. So basically, I'm having a two-contract DTO, which takes whatever has been sent and just give me my DTO back. And then I'm able to use it in my action to store everything. So yeah, my naming is not always really good, so I get to have the fully clarified last names, but at least I'm now able to say, okay, so I'll get a DTO from the request, and then passing that DTO as an entity to something which is contact here, my model, in Laravel, which would be somehow my repository, I guess, kind of, and then doing whatever the framework does. So what's your domain? In our case, we're just managing a collection of contacts, which would be something like this in UML. So we've got a client who can call a repository to get information from somewhere, and then this information would be contacts. So what can we do on the Symfony app to improve what we've done already? What we've done is we've decoupled the database from the form, basically. We haven't done anything else yet. So we need to work out a way to decouple the database from probably the controller layer. So that's something that has been generated by Symfony itself, the maker bundle at least. And if you look at it, that's supposed to be your repository. And if it's your domain repository, that means you're coupling your domain to Dutrion, because the service entity repository is a Dutrion thing. So you might not want that. So let's try it out and change it to something else, like composition instead of inheritance would be nice. So now I've got this class, which is a plain PHP class. It contains somehow a collection of entities. We don't really know how it contains this collection, whether it's a memory collection, whether it's whatever. We don't really care at this point. We just know it contains a collection, and we can find all the records, find one record, and there are plenty of other methods. So let's abstract it again and create a proper interface. It's not actually a proper interface, because a proper interface would be, as the solid principle state, would be way more smaller. So you could do at least 5 interfaces here, and then have one big interface extending all of the others. I've not been that deep in this talk, because that's another talk that's completely linked to the eye of the solid principles. And there's a very good talk from Dan Aykroyd from, I think that was 2015 in PHP Northwest. You can find it online. He basically spent 45 minutes talking about how you can do interface segregation, which is quite impressive, I would say, because that seems like a very small topic, but it's not. And so let's go with this here and say we don't really care. We'll go with a massive contract anyway. What do we have in it? We only have domain stuff. So we've got contracts here, which are actually our entity, contract entity, which, if you remember, is completely decoupled from the framework. It's a plain PHP object. And we've got probably some objects implementing that, which would also be PHP objects without a link to a library. Right, so what we can do if we implement this interface is actually, instead of going fetching Dutrion as it was done before, using this get Dutrion, get repository, whatever, which happens to be a service locator, if you look at it the right way. In this case, we can just say, OK, this object now in communication with another object which implements this interface, so has a very few methods, 5 of them right now, and just call it. So you're, again, because you're inversing dependency, so that's the D of solid principles, you're composing with an interface here, so you'll get your implementation, but still you can change it whenever you want, and that's pretty cool. looking back at Laravel, how does it look? What if we just copied the same interface? It's an interface, so we're allowed to do that. It's not tied to your framework anyway. And then just creating a contract repository. So we had this contact repository in Symfony, which was taking as a dependency the entity manager, because it was linked to Dutrion. In this case here, we're just using Eloquent instead of using Dutrion. So pretty much the same. We've got facades, which are not actually facades. It's more of a proxy, but yeah. And so you've got facades, which helps you contacting this contact model, which is an alias for my contact class from Laravel. And basically, contact used to have the ability to manage the collection. So that's my repository, my actual non-domain-related repository, my persistence repository, if you will. And this contact repository here is the bridge between my interface, which is my domain, and my actual implementation. So basically, what we're doing is just calling whatever contact model we have, and that's it. So moving from one to the other is a matter of like a few seconds, I would say. Because it's Laravel, you still need to register your services, while in Symfony you didn't need that because you had only one class implementing the interface, so the container can just work his magic and bind it by himself. In this case here, Laravel has a method you can call in Artisan to create the class, and you just need to create your binding yourself. Don't forget to put the provider as well. So the provider here is just a config to tell Laravel you actually want to call that. When I was writing the talk, I forgot it a few times, and that's just not working, so don't forget it. And then you can just call your contract repository just like we did in Symfony, because Laravel has quite good dependency injection container as well, so it can basically inject whatever you want. And then it just looks like what we've done before, calling the repository, and that's done. So now we've got all this domain layer completely decoupled from the front, which is pretty cool. All right, so what else do we need? As Heraclitus said, the only thing that is constant is change. So you might wonder why every example I take is so complex for such a small use case. But it's basically because we will never have to work on a project that is a CRUD project, basically. No one will pay you for that. So if you're working on a project, that means people will constantly come to you and ask you for new stuff. So say someone wants you to add some logging to your application, and you've done all the decoupling we've done before. So now we've got this actual layer of domain logic. What can you do? You can either go for, but not exclusively, go for a decorator on your left, which will decorate your service and inject your logger and just log before or log after calling your method. Or you could do something with an observer, or maybe if you're doing it with framework, not an observer, but some kind of observer, yeah, weird observer events. So going with the first solution, the decorator, which is one I like quite a lot, and I don't see quite a lot in projects. Going with a decorator pattern is quite simple, actually. You've got your component here, which is an abstraction, and then you want to decorate your component. That means you want to put something around your component, which has the exact same interface. So you can actually put your component inside the other one and just decorate around. That's how it goes. So we had our contract repository interface with a few methods. To make it simple, I kept just one here, but because I've got this interface, I'm supposed to have 5 of them. So again, look at Dan's talk on interface segregation. That's going to help you quite a lot if you're doing decorators. And basically what happens is I have to respect the same contract, but I'm also allowed to inject my repository inside of it. Again, I'm coding again interfaces all of the time. This way, I know I'm quite extensible. So going this way, you're able to decorate the service, meaning you're able to, in this case, put a logger after calling your actual repository. And yeah, that's if you code completely outside of any framework. So what happens if you want to do that in Symfony? You basically take the class we've done before, put this bit of configuration, and that's done. So again, everything you've done before for decoupling your code will help you quite a lot when you want to extend it. And what if you want to do that in Laravel? So we had this binding before, just add the few lines here, and you're done as well. So sometimes you see people online complaining about Laravel, for instance. I'm not a big fan myself, but you can see that implementations are quite similar. Like, if you actually know design patterns, that's the exact same stuff. So one is not better than the other, I guess. And if we go back a few slides here, you can see I'm using the logger interface as well, which is a PSR-free logger interface for what matters. Which means, because I'm using only this PSR-free interface and my own interface for my own domain, I'm basically able to take my class, move it from one framework to the other, both respect PSR-free, so I'm just good, just like it. Have you heard about PSR7? It's been here for a while now. It's been quite controversial, I guess. It led to some conflict between the major framework. And basically, what it does is it describes what a server request is and what a server response is. And say you work on Laravel and Symfony in the same time. That's what we've been doing right now, but in some case, in some company, you might have real use case where you're working with both. And on both projects, you want to implement a health check endpoint. So you've got different solutions. Either you could 2 endpoints, one in Laravel, one in Symfony, and you're good with that. So that means the Symfony one will be tied to HTTP Foundation. The Laravel one will be tied to eliminate whatever the HTTP layer is. But if you want it for both, you could simply say, OK, let's have a look at PSRs and look at PSR7 and see if there are bridges. And obviously, PHP is quite a vibrant community, so people are actually developing to make things better. So you've got bridges. I'm actually using Zendiactoros because I like it, and Neon PSR7 because there's a bug in the bridge. So you should not need both. And basically what we're doing is, instead of using a controller, I'm going to use a PSR7 action. So creating my route will be just the same as before. And just for fun, I've added a time zone, optional time zone, so we can play with the endpoint a bit. And that's my action. So the invoke action here make your class a callable, which means in here, you're not forced to put the colon and then whatever action you want to call. And it takes a server request interface, which is the PSR7 implementation of, not implementation, but interface, obviously, for what's a request. And in this case, the object I'll get back is probably a PSR7 object from the Neon library. And then it's sending a response, a JSON response from Zendiactoros. Because it's easy to use, so yeah. And if you look at here, at what you get here, there's actually nothing at all that looks like something from Symfony. It's completely decoupled from your Symfony project. The only thing that ties you to your Symfony project is your configuration, which is pretty great. It means that if you go to your Laravel project, you probably just need to find the same exact bridge because the HTTP layer is somehow common at some level, and just put the exact same route, different way to write it, but exact same route, and that's done, basically. Because your object here is not tied to your framework, you can move it from one framework to the other, just using bridges. There's a small drawback to doing that in terms of performance, obviously, because that means each time you get to this route, you're basically taking the framework object, converting it to the PSR7 object, and then taking the PSR7 response and converting it back to your framework response, which is an overhead, obviously. But depends on your use case again. Right. So I've been way too fast. So basically, what I wanted you to take out from this talk is that frameworks are really implementation details. So instead of looking at frameworks documentation, I guess people should rather look at proper literature and have a look at, say, object calisthenics, solid principles, and then try to find out how your framework can actually help you doing stuff rather than constrain you into some way of doing what you're doing. Like, we often hear about the Laravel way to do stuff. What does that even mean? I mean, it's not a thing. So just think about what you're doing. Think about all of these things here. And yeah, try not to follow blindly everything you can read in documentations. Documentations are partially marketing instruments. So what people will always try to tell you is it's easy to use. You can do it in a few minutes, but you wouldn't get paid as much if that was that easy. So yeah, just take a step back. Right, and that was me. So I went really way too fast. If you have any question, I think the Slido app was running as well. So just, yeah. Right, so the first question is, why even use Symfony or any other framework if you do not use the benefits of that a framework provides, annotations and so on? Why use a framework if you don't want to be coupled to anything? Basically, the framework is here to help you do the glue between your actual domain, which is the thing you're actually selling, and whatever interface you need to have with either people using UI or any other system you can have. If you've been to, I can't remember his name, but there's been a talk on DDD yesterday, which explains it quite well, I think, with some diagrams on actual hexagonal architecture. And basically, the problem with, yeah, in your case, you're wondering why you wouldn't use all of what the framework provides. You can use everything. There's actually no problem with that if you're doing a rapid application development kind of project. The problem is most of the time, people come to you, say, this is a very small project, or this is a prototype, or whatever. And prototypes end up being production at some point. And then it's way too late to decouple from your framework. The problem with being coupled is if you have responsibilities in your work, say you're doing banking stuff, you probably have accreditations like PCI DSS or stuff like that. And if you do have this kind of certifications, you can't use a tool that is not supported anymore. So if you're coupled to your framework and you've had, say, 5 years of code, you basically have no other choice than rewriting your application if the framework's not supported anymore and you've been completely coupled to it. And that's going to be a very complex project and very costly as well. So yeah, that's mostly why you don't want to be coupled. In some cases, you might want to be coupled, though. I've been working on a project recently where, so as a freelancer, where the company behind this project didn't know who was maintaining the project after. And the problem is the company is based in Paris, so hiring is pretty hard. So I kind of assumed that the people who would take the project after me would be junior developer, just out of school, knowing Symfony, but Symfony in the way it's described in the documentation. So I basically went with annotations and everything else. Because sometimes it's more about communication with your team than actually proper software engineering. And some other times, that's more about doing the right thing if you know that can be maintained after. So yeah, that's kind of what I would say about that. So software engineering in general is not that easy, so you can't really say that's the right way. So what I'm offering here is just a view on don't be as critical on frameworks, don't get tied to your frameworks, just have a look at what you can do and how you can change from one to the other. And yeah, that's basically what it was. I'll switch to the second one. What is your preferred and the cleanest directory structure under the SRC there? That's a complex one as well. My favorite way to write in it would be kind of tending to what you can find in hexagonal architecture, I guess, with domain, infrastructure, application, and which one did I miss? Domain, architecture, infrastructure, UI, yeah. And so this way you get a quite well-defined structure. Most of the time I would go one level deeper, so I get my context as well. So something like SRC, user, and then some kind of hexagonal architecture in it. Again, that's my own preference. The best way to do that is basically discuss with your team, because if someone don't really get the wording you use, the names you're using or anything, you will have crappy code at some point. So it's more about communication again than really anything else. And documentation is quite important as well, because if you leave someone who just read the Symfony documentation in a fully DDD architectured project, that's going to end bad. You said you're not a fan of Laravel. What do you think are the biggest advantages of Symfony over Laravel? This one's pretty easy. Laravel does a lot of magic. Symfony doesn't. So that would be just that. What I call magic might be, if you look at Eloquent, for instance, there are actual magic in it, magic method, getters, which are not really descriptive in my own opinion. And you don't get to, because it's active record, you don't get to describe very precisely every contract you're doing. So if you know what's inside of your database, you know what you can call. But why would you know if you're doing the front-end bit? Why would you know what the database has as a column? I mean, databases are not your job. Your job would be front-end. So yeah, that would be mainly that. And then if you look at other bits, there's a lot of inheritance as well in Laravel, which are kind of annoying at some point, because if you inherit instead of composing, you can end up with weird stuff. Inheritance should be reserved to proper functional inheritance. Like if you have two objects which have the same behaviors, meaning functional behaviors, you can do an inheritance. Like, I don't know, when you're doing adapters, for instance, that's one of the cases you could do inheritance without worrying. If you're doing inheritance, there's a quite well-known use case of inheritance which bothers me a lot. It's controllers. Controllers should not inherit. They are not sharing functional stuff. So you can basically compose, just do what we've done here, and pass your interface, have your binding on your container level, and that's done. What is the actual practical benefits of applying these techniques? It feels like adding a lot of complexity for the switching framework edge case. Switching framework is not as much edge case as you could think. I've been switching frameworks on projects for the past probably 5 years or something. First because people were leaving Zen 1, then because they had to move to PHP 7, and they were doing some crappy stuff with crappy old framework. And I guess we will have some other problems later on, so that's always quite a use case. The other thing is, even if you don't want to move frameworks, you get from decoupling, you get quite a lot of advantages. Like if you actually use the solid principles, it's way easier to extend your program. While if you're using the rapid application development way, you tend to have quite big controllers, or if it's not quite big controllers, you'll probably end up with a lot of services. By the way, service doesn't mean anything, so yeah, you basically take whatever you had as a fat controller before, put it in another file, that's the exact same. So yeah, it's mostly, it helps you with actually changing frameworks, but it also helps you with weird cases where you want to use in one specific case some other libraries. Say you want to do logging, for instance. Logging is quite a good example. In PHP, you want to do logging, you'll do a PSR3 interface, and then you'll probably bind Monolog behind it. And then you end up on a project where logging is done in database, relational database, which is a very bad practice. Happens quite a lot in finance, I would say. And you just look at your library, Monolog, and there's no adapter for MySQL, which makes sense. It's actually a bad practice. So, but because it's PSR3, and you've coded against interface instead of whatever you wanted to do before, you're able to just make a very small configuration inside of your container and say, OK, for all of my controllers, or all of my services, whenever I ask for logging in a logger, you're going to give me Monolog. But when it's this very specific bit of my code, and I ask for a logger, you're going to give me, say, a Zenlog. Zenlog does have an adapter for database, so you're all set. And whenever you introduce new best practices and try to log elsewhere than your database, you're all set. There's no more work to do for you, just changing configuration, and that's pretty cool. How old is the oldest app you have developed in a coupled manner and deployed to production? How complex is it? Because I'm a consultant, I'm not staying too many years on a project, because that would cost quite a lot to my client. But I've seen a couple of projects which were probably 10 plus years old and really, really crappy. But it's not really a problem. It was highly coupled to ZF1 mostly. And the problem with Zen1 was the database access, which was not a proper active record, but something slightly similar. And so you had this massive coupling between your database access layer and your front-end layer, which makes it quite hard to refactor. So the way we usually go on this kind of projects is basically wrap the old application inside of a new application. Say you put a Symfony 4 outside of your Zen1, and your whenever you hit 404, you basically fall back on Zen. And then you can rewrite parts of it in your new SRC folder and just move it this way. But it takes ages to do that. Like I've migrated an app which was not that big, I would say. Probably a couple of 100 classes or something like that. So really not big, and it took probably 2 or 3 months with a team of decent developer, I would say. So yeah, it just cost quite a lot. While if you do it in a sensible manner at first, that's quite easy to work out after. When I say in a sensible manner, again, you don't need to decouple everything, and just do accept wherever it really helps to be coupled, and try to work out the trade-off of saying, okay, I can invest on my future on this bit, but I'll still be coupled on this bit because I don't care. Usually, whenever I discuss with, I can't remember his name again, but the guy who leads Symfony in France, he's really keen on the abstract controller and the controller trait, which I don't like personally. But for him, because it's your UI layer, it doesn't matter whether you're coupled to your framework or not. So it seems reasonable to me to say, okay, that's my actual UI. So whenever I'll change it, lots of stuff will change anyway. So I accept to be coupled on this very specific bit. It doesn't really bother. What are your thoughts on PSR7 controversy? That's a hard one as well. I don't get why there's so much controversy. The problem is wider than just software engineering, I guess. So it's a tricky question. But PSR7 has been designed as a new representation of the HTTP request and HTTP response. And some people were more into the position where they wanted it to be compatible first with the existing solutions rather than going into a direction. So that's what happened, basically. The problem is, on one side, you've got maintainers who can actually see the problematics they will have to actually implement the new PSR. And on the other side, you've got dreamers, which kind of are only thinking about what's good in terms of software engineering. And obviously, having a request that can't change is really good. But then if you've built your own whole framework around the fact the request element evolves in the different bits of your dispatch. That was the basic problem. And I can understand that, yeah, there's been a controversy. The problem is, as a community, we should not stop on these kind of small details, I would say, and just carry on, offer alternatives. And yeah, that hasn't been done because of politics, ego, and stuff. This one already answered. Is it really practical to have this big anti-corruption layer around the ORM? How often do you switch the ORM? Actually, I'm not switching ORMs. I'm actually switching from an ORM to something else. So usually, the problem you'll get is performance issues first, in which case you might not want to use an ORM, but rather use native queries. And if you do that, the ORM will probably get in the way at some point. Another thing you can have is moving from an ORM to actually doing service-oriented architecture, or microservices, as they call it. But if you do microservices, you're not supposed to actually call in real time. But if you do service-oriented architecture, you might want to change your repository from fetching from the database to fetching from a service, an external service, in which case, if you haven't decoupled your repository layer from your actual database access layer, you'll get stuck with that, which is not really great. If you try to go into hexagonal architecture and you're doing multiple context, you also have the problematic of how do you handle communication between your contexts. And basically, the way you handle this communication is either by messaging, which works quite well, so sending events, basically, or you could also do actual calls using a bridge. So some kind of adapters, say you've got I don't know, a company context and you've got an invoice context, and you want to do a link between both. So basically, your company context will know about any invoice UID or whatever you use as an identifier, but they won't know anything else about this invoicing system. And what you need to do is whenever some user wants to fetch all of the invoices it has, you'll go through your infrastructure from the first context to the infrastructure of the other context. And you can do that if you're decoupled. You can't if you're coupled to your database. So yeah, basically just that. Do you go with PSR7 in Symfony projects considering the overhead? I actually do on some projects which are more for fun than actually production. I wouldn't do that in a proper production environment because you never actually know what the application load will be. Sometimes you get to a project, the person will tell you, okay, we've got 10 employees using this software, so yeah, go crazy, performance-wise, do whatever you want. Never go crazy, because there are 10 now, maybe tomorrow there are 100, 1,000, you never know. And maybe you'll have some other performance issues, so don't really decouple if there's no reason for it. What I've showed you during the talk is you can have some part of your code in PSR7 and some other part in whatever the framework provides, which is a quite good alternative, I guess, which helps you with actually using PSR7 for third-party libraries or code you want to share with other projects. But then for your own code, you could just go with your framework. Do you have example where it's actually fine to be coupled to the framework? Examples. So if you work with junior people who are doing like this very small 3-month training or stuff like that, they only know about the Symfony or Laravel documentation. So for them, going from that to whatever you do with decoupling is just a massive overhead. So you'll just drown them before starting working. That's going to be a disaster. So I guess that's reasonable enough to say you can get couple if the environment requires it. And another thing where you can get couple is when you're in your UI layer, you can basically do whatever you want. Right, there's one more, why not eloquent? And I guess, yeah, that's quite a big question. So whoever posted it, you can come talk to me after. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And have a good day.